Most cyclists and triathletes have some sort of power meter on their bike and use power to be able to track their intensity throughout the training sessions and through their races. But do you actually know how power meters work in general and how the different types of power meters work? That's what we're going to cover in today's video, so stick around and you'll find out exactly how a power meter on your bike is giving you a reading that's going to be useful for you in training and racing. Hey guys, Nick here. Welcome back to the channel, talking science of endurance and sports science in general. Really enjoyed making the video so far, and I've been a bit slack in the last couple of weeks, and there's good reason. As you can tell, I think in the last video is the first one in the new space, but moved house throughout the isolation period, and it sort of threw everything out a little bit. So getting back on track now, making some videos. So if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button down below. Plenty of people are jumping on. I'm surprised after only just over a month on YouTube, we're already at sort of 90 odd subscribers. And there's one video in particular I do want you to check out. I'm going to link it above. It's gone amazingly so far. It's how VO2 max is calculated on your Garmin watch. 2,500 last time I checked, people viewed it, which is absolutely bananas. So thank you for the support so far. Thanks for the comments as well, all the positive feedback coming through. And like I said, hit the subscribe button down below to check out any of the latest videos coming soon. As I said in the intro, today's video is all about power meters on the bike and how they work, how they're giving you a reading of intensity for your racing and training. Most triathletes and cyclists are going to have some sort of power meter. I mean, it's almost a standard now that you have some sort of power meter reading, whether that be on bike, through an on-bike meter, crank, pedal, at the hub, wherever it may be, or if you're using a smart trainer, you're using Zwift on a Wahoo Kicker, Tax Neo, whatever trainer you're using, some sort of smart trainer has a power meter inbuilt into it. So it's kind of taken over the industry, but a lot of people don't actually know how these power meters work. And that's what I want to break down today. And it's a very, very simple process of measuring really the forces surrounding cycling and looking at a really just bring it back to how much energy we're expending and what the output, physical output is from us, minus all of the aerodynamics that goes into cycling as well. And this is the part of it that, I mean, makes a lot of sense in terms of the speed. And when we look at speed and how fast we're actually going, how fast we're covering distance, aerodynamics plays a really big role. But from a training stimulus perspective and looking at the predicting performance in a race, power is always going to be the best metric because it brings everyone back essentially on a level playing field. We take out all the aerodynamic calculations, and if everyone's got the same wind resistance on the day, same rolling resistance, if you had similar aero positions with similar size athletes, whoever puts out the most power is going to be the winner at the end of the day because they're going to go the fastest, because there is a direct correlation between power and speed. But how do we actually get this power reading is the critical part of the equation. And what we have really, power is made up of two key components. So power overall is equal to the force that is output by the legs into the pedal, into the crank, wherever it may be, which, because we're working in a circle, is actually called a torque instead of a force. Torque, force, it's the same thing. It's a force applied around an axis. So if you think about the pedal going around the crank and it goes in a circular motion, we're applying it to the outside away from the axis to then cause those the cranks and the pedals to spin, and that drives the bike and allows the chain and the drivetrain to actually do its thing and propel the bike forward. So if we're just pushing into the ground, like if we're running, for example, we're just pushing the ground, that's a force because we're directly acting into the point where we want to put the force. Straight through the axis, if you like, there is no axis, there's no circular motion. But because we're talking about angular and we're talking about around a circle, and it's rotating and creating rotation through the crank, it's actually called a torque. So we apply a torque to the end of the crank, we multiply that by the angular velocity, so essentially how fast it's spinning. From a cycling perspective, we all know this as cadence, revolutions per minute, how quickly we turn the pedals. So the torque, how much pressure or force you're putting on the crank around that axis, multiplied by how fast you spin those pedals, the cadence or the angular velocity, gives us our power reading. And that's essentially how we're getting power on the bike, is we're measuring the forces applied around that axis, and then the cadence or the pace, the speed at which they're moving gives us power overall. Anywhere throughout the drivetrain, we can theoretically calculate force because everywhere is going to have the same torque going through it. It's just moved around. So if we apply a torque to the crank, that then gets transferred into, if we apply it to the end of the crank or the pedal, for example, that gets transferred into the crank, that gets transferred into the spider of the crank, that gets transferred down into the hub on the rear wheel. So at any of these points, we can measure other power output because they're all going to then have some sort of cadence. Back wheel spins, crank is going to spin, crank arm is going to go around, the pedal is going to go around, etc. So there's going to be all those components to it regardless of where we measure it. We potentially do lose out though based on where we measure it because, as most people know, there is drivetrain losses. You put a force out at the pedal or the end of the crank arm, by the time all of it gets transferred down into the hub, there is going to be a little bit of drivetrain loss. As efficient as you want to get your drivetrain with ceramic bearings, things like that, you're eventually going to have some sort of losses at the hub. So you might be losing out a little bit there with a hub-based power meter. But from the most part, most of those ones up the front, and they're typical power meters, crank arm, crank spider, and pedals, they're the typical sort of three that we commonly see, or most athletes have. You're not really going to see too much loss in terms of power meter reading, because it's the direct measurement on the bike at the point or the source of where the force, the torque around the pedals is coming. How that's measured is through what we call a strain gauge. So essentially, when you push down on the pedals, there's a little strain gauge, and that's where, if you have a look at the back of a crank arm based power meter, there's a little box on the back, and it kind of just looks like a cadence sensor, and there's a cadence sensor in there as well to measure that angular velocity. But inside of that is a little strain gauge, and it's measuring essentially, as the name suggests, the strain on whatever part of the equipment it is on. So when you apply force to it, it's going to sort of, well, you can't see it, they're quite stiff, and if we have carbon cranks, things like that, they're going to be really stiff, but there is some sort of bending happening in it, and it's measuring the forces through the strain on the object. So crank arm, you're going to have that little sensor partway down. In the spider, it's going to be spread out, distributed around the inside of the spider. On the pedals, it's inside the pedal itself, basically allowing us, wherever we want to measure that force or that torque from, to give us a power reading, the strain gauge is placed in the most appropriate spot. So this is where we can also get some variance between pedal-based, crank arm, and then spider. And why typically the spider-based is the best is because we get a greater area to put that strain gauge, and potentially there's going to be a couple of different strain gauges linking up together. Crank, again, it's part way up. You might lose out as well if you've only got a single-sided crank, you're only measuring one side. We could have some imbalance. That's why dual-sided power is typically a really sort of go-to for a lot of athletes, and a lot of coaches want that two-sided power, or sports scientists want the two-sided power to see left versus right balance. And pedal-based, we're going to have a smaller strain gauge purely from the fact of the size of the pedal, so it may not be able to read as accurately as a bigger gauge itself, and read at a higher rate of or frequency, which I'll get to in a second in terms of being really useful, as we want a really high rate of being able to measure the actual forces on the pedals or through the drivetrain. Like I said, there's going to be a cadence sensor in there as well to measure the angular velocity, and that's how we're getting our direct measurement of power throughout the drivetrain, whichever part of the drivetrain you're going to have your power meter on. We can also measure this externally. So you might have seen these little pods that sit at the front of your bike. They go under the handlebars where the stem is. They're looking more at the forces of drag in particular. So wind resistance and anything that's acting on you, basically slowing you down. And then based on an equation and using that information that's collecting from that drag reading, it's then going to calculate power based on those external forces. Because, like I said, there's a really strong relationship between power output and speed when we look at all the variables, and we can basically calculate what our rolling resistance is, we can calculate what our wind resistance is, we can calculate our aerodynamics overall. If we know what our power is, everything, like, it's just solving for X, is very basic maths. You just rearrange the formula to find what you want. So if you have all those drag forces, and you can actually look at what the drag forces acting on the cyclist and the bike are, then we can work out what power is based off what speed is. Opposite way, if we look at what our power reading is and we know what our drag forces are, we can also look at what our speed is. So it's all interconnected, and that's how we can get these external readings. And that's why you sometimes see they're pretty rare. I don't see too many athletes use them, if any at all, using those little pods on the front of their bike. Probably it's an external measurement, so we're not directly measuring the strain or the torque going through the bike itself. So it is an external measurement when there is a bit of calculation going on. So that's where you're going to get a bit of error, similar to drivetrain losses as well. Probably more so, but can be a good option for if you are moving between bikes. And this is where I'll get to the practical side of things in a moment, but moving between bikes, it can be a bit tricky if you sometimes have to buy power meters for multiple bikes. Last thing I'll look at before talking about where I recommend the power meter best sort of sits and which part of the drivetrain and what types of power meters to look at is the rate at which we get the sample rate of measurement. So typically this is measured in hertz. Most Garmin GPS watches are probably going to be in a hertz of like 1 hertz, 2 hertz. And what does that mean? Hertz is just measurements per second. So 1 hertz would be 1 sample per second. So you get 1 data point every second that it ticks over. So it's not, when I say it's not giving us a lot, if you add that up over a long period of time, 2 hours, 3 hours, yeah, there's going to be a lot of data points. Compared to something like the GPS units that AFL players have or soccer players have, they can measure up to sort of 15, 20 hertz now, some of the newer ones. That's 20 samples every second. You're going to get very, very accurate data of where that player is on the field, or where that athlete is within the space that they're working, so, and what speed they're going, etc., because we've got all these very finely tuned points in time. This is where we need to look at the type of power meter as well, and typically if you spend a little bit more money, you're probably going to have a high sampling rate, and that's also going to give us a bit of accuracy also. In the smart trainers, we might get a bit more accuracy as well, because the strain gauge can be bigger, and that also might give us the capability to put a more powerful way of reading power or reading force, angular velocity as well, that's going to give us a greater sample rate too. So something worthwhile checking out if you can is try to look at what the sample rate is, and higher is better for accuracy in terms of getting more data points. But just keep in mind that if you are analysing it by yourself, and you're not using a software and you're just doing some manual analysis, you're going to have a lot of data to sift through, and it might take longer to download the data as well. That's the sort of the trade-off. If you have hundreds of thousands and millions of data points because you have really accurate high sample rate, it's going to take you forever to download onto your device, and you might have to leave it for 10-15 minutes. Something to keep in mind, particularly when we're looking at, a lot of cyclists are using their phone just to read their data at the end of a session. So something to think about when you are looking at power meters as well. The last thing I'm going to cover today is where I reckon the power meter is best suited, and some examples of those types of power meters. Like I said before, we want to try and avoid some of that drivetrain loss, and we want to try and increase the accuracy as best we can. So really, the best places, the most accurate places to have a power meter are in the crank spider, so within the actual crank, the crank spider itself, or on the crank arm, and ideally some sort of measurement of a dual-sided is going to give us that even look if we're looking left versus right. If you're in the crank spider, not necessarily going to get left and right, but you're going to get a very accurate reading because it's right in the center point of where all that force we want to be going, where the axis is. On the crank arm, that's again directly measuring where we're putting the force at the end of that arm, and the strain gauge is going to pick that up really well. Probably second on that list, or I guess in terms of examples of those, in the spider, there's heaps of examples, but Power to Max is one that comes to mind that's really good. I know SRM do a really good spider as well. I don't have any bias here. I'm just sort of listing brands off the top of my head. From a crank arm perspective, everyone knows Stages. There's Pioneer. There's so many different crank-based power meters out there on the market. There's 3i. There's heaps to choose from, and they're all probably pretty similar in terms of they're just as good as each other, to be honest. It's all pretty similar technology. When we then start to move away from that, though, so I'd probably say Spider, Ideal, Crank probably a very close second. Pedals probably a third. They're starting to get a little bit better. I think the Favero ones now are looking really good. The new ones, I've had a few athletes use those, and they seem to be producing some really solid readings. The Garmin Vectors are a tried and true power meter pedal as well. The bonus of those, if we're looking at pros and cons, is that you can change them across bikes really easy. Take the pedals off, put the pedals on the new bike, recalibrate. Whereas the crank-based stuff, you basically need to buy new cranks to then put on that bike and change them over. It can be a lengthy process, or it's expensive if you just get two crank-based power meters or crank set-based power meters and put one on one bike, one on the other. Particularly triathletes who might have a time trial bike and a road bike, or even cyclists who do a bit of time trialing as well, have the two bikes. Can be a bit of a pain to switch across. Then last, we'd be talking about the hub. I mean, it's a good alternative. Typically, they're probably a little bit cheaper, but you have to change the whole hub of your wheel, and is that a pain? Yes, because if you're using a training set and a racing set, and if you have multiple racing sets, some guys might run a disc on race day for time trialing or triathlon. Some guys might run a deep section wheel. They might, based on conditions, want to run a slightly less deep or a shallower wheel set, and then go into training. So it can be a pain to flick across. So that's where practicality-wise, the pedals do really well comparatively. But are you losing out a little bit on the accuracy? Maybe a little bit. I'm not going to say definitely, but I reckon there probably is, just purely from the size of the technology has to be a lot smaller. So at the moment, probably not going to be as accurate and effective as where we've just got bigger size. And that's like anything. You think about the original mobile phone was huge. It was a giant brick, and you had to carry this like briefcase to carry around. Whereas now we have iPhones that are tiny. I mean, you can fit it in your pocket, and I know they're getting bigger from a screen size, but you think about how powerful the phone is now compared to what it was. We're still heading there from power meters. We're nowhere near the same level as what we are with technology like phones or laptops and things like that yet. it's going to get there, which is going to be good. So the pedals, I'm sure, are going to get better, and it's going to be sort of the way to go in the future, and I suspect based on the practicality and use of them. So hopefully that gives you a bit of a summary of power meters, how they actually work, what's going on. Leave in the comments down below what power meter you use and how you find it. I mean, do you use a power meter that's based on the crankset at the hub? Are you using an external measurement power meter that's taking into calculation your drag forces and then working out power that way? Are you using pedals? Let me know exactly what you're using down below. I personally use a Pioneer dual-sided crankset on my time trial bike. Don't have on my road bike, so I am looking for a road bike power meter. If anyone wants to suggest one that I should try a look at for my road bike stuff, let me know. Otherwise, if you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button down below. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did get something out of it as well, I'd love it if you hit the thumbs up button. Definitely lets me know that you got something positive out of the video, and any feedback is always appreciated. So that's it for today, and we'll see you in the next one.